Hello and welcome to Easy English Stories. Today, I have a story that is heavy with silence, memory, and a secret that waited patiently in a cardboard box for 30 years to be found. This story is called The Photograph in the Attic, and it is for Level 3 learners. So listen carefully for more advanced vocabulary and longer, more complex sentences. This is a story about inheritance, not only of money or houses, but of the things our parents never quite managed to tell us. My name is Renata Alves. I am 34 years old, and I work as an architect in a mid-sized city restoring old buildings that most people would rather demolish than repair. There is something in me that has always been drawn to structures with history, to walls that have absorbed decades of arguments and celebrations and silences, structures that refuse to disclose their full stories to anyone who has not earned the right to ask. My father, Antonio, died 8 months ago, quietly, in his sleep, at the age of 71. He had lived alone since my mother passed away 11 years earlier, in the same modest house where I had grown up, a house perched at the edge of a small orchard he tended with a devotion that bordered on obsession. My father was, by every account, an unremarkable man. He worked as an accountant for a small textile company for nearly 4 decades. He kept meticulous records of everything, from his monthly expenses to the exact dates each of his fruit trees had bloomed. He was reserved to the point of being nearly invisible in crowds, the kind of man who preferred listening to speaking, and who, even within our own family, rarely volunteered information about himself unless directly asked. After the funeral, it fell to me, as an only child, to sort through the accumulated remnants of his entire life. My cousin Marisa offered to help, and together we spent several exhausting weekends going through closets, drawers, and the small cramped attic that my father had never allowed anyone, not even my mother, to fully organize. The attic was where I found the box. It was an unremarkable cardboard box, slightly water-stained at the corners, tucked behind a stack of old tax records from the 1980s. Inside, beneath a layer of yellowed newspaper, I discovered a small collection of photographs I had never seen before, along with a handful of letters bound loosely with a disintegrating rubber band. The photographs depicted a woman I did not recognize, young, perhaps in her early 20s, with dark curling hair and an unmistakably mischievous smile. In several of the photographs, she stood beside a man who was unmistakably my father, decades younger, his posture looser and more relaxed than I had ever witnessed in life. In one particular photograph, the woman held an infant swaddled in white cloths, and my father stood beside her with an expression of such tender pride that I had to sit down on the dusty attic floor, my legs suddenly unwilling to support me. I turned the photograph over. Written in faded ink, in handwriting I did not immediately recognize as my father's, though it later proved to be his younger hand, were 3 words. Us, finally, 1987. I was born in 1992. My hands trembling, I opened the letters. They were written by the woman in the photographs, whose name, I gathered from the salutations, was Clara. The letters spanned roughly 2 years, from 1985 to 1987, and they were, unmistakably, love letters, written with an intimacy and an emotional candor that felt almost indecent for me to be reading, as though I were trespassing on a version of my father I had never been permitted to know. But it was the final letter, dated just weeks before that photograph labeled Us, Finally, that unsettled me most profoundly. In it, Clara wrote about a daughter, a baby girl she referred to only as our little one, expressing anticipation about beginning a life as a family, the 3 of them together, away from what she described only as complications we can finally leave behind. I sat in the attic for nearly an hour, the box open before me, trying to reconcile the reserved, orchard-tending father I had known my entire life with the man who had apparently, at some point before my own birth, built and possibly abandoned an entire family I had never known existed. Marisa found me there eventually, and I showed her what I had discovered. She was as bewildered as I was. Neither of us had ever heard my father mention a woman named Clara, nor any child besides myself. I did not sleep that night. I lay awake constructing and dismantling theories, each more disquieting than the last. Had my father been married before, in secret, and simply never disclosed it? Had this little one grown up somewhere, unaware of her own paternity, perhaps living within driving distance of the very house in which I had been raised? Or worse, had something happened? Some tragedy that explained why this entire chapter of my father's life had been so thoroughly, deliberately excised from the narrative he presented to my mother and to me. The following week, I began almost obsessively to investigate. I started with the return addresses on the envelopes, which led me to an apartment building in a neighboring city, a building that, unsurprisingly, after nearly 4 decades, had long since been renovated beyond recognition. I searched public records for a woman named Clara with my father's surname, or any variation suggesting marriage, and found nothing conclusive. I considered hiring a private investigator, an option that felt simultaneously excessive and, given the magnitude of what I might be uncovering, entirely reasonable. It was Marisa, ultimately, who suggested the most obvious avenue I had somehow overlooked: my father's oldest living friend, a man named Ricardo, who had known him since their university years and who had, remarkably, attended both my parents' wedding and, I would later learn, considerably more than that. I visited Ricardo at his home, an elderly man now in his late 70s, his mind still sharp despite the frailty that had settled into his body. I brought the photographs and the letters, laid them across his kitchen table, and asked him, without preamble, to tell me who Clara was. Ricardo's expression upon seeing the photographs transformed immediately into something between sorrow and relief, as though he had been waiting, quietly, for someone to finally ask him this question. "Clara," he said slowly, "was the great tragedy of your father's life, and also, in a way, the reason he became the man you knew." According to Ricardo, my father and Clara had met in their early 20s and had fallen into a relationship of extraordinary intensity. They had planned to marry. Clara had indeed become pregnant, and the child depicted in that photograph was real, a daughter my father had, in fact, briefly known. But Clara, Ricardo explained, had suffered from a severe and progressive illness that had gone undiagnosed for years, something involving her heart, exacerbated tragically by complications during childbirth. She had died when the child, whom she had named Beatrice, was scarcely 4 months old. My father, devastated beyond what Ricardo could adequately convey even decades later, had been entirely unprepared, both emotionally and practically, to raise an infant alone. Clara's own mother, still grieving her daughter's sudden death, had offered to raise Beatrice herself. In another city, and my father, in what Ricardo described as the single most agonizing decision of his life, had agreed, believing, perhaps correctly, that the child would fare better with a stable, grieving grandmother than with a young father drowning in his own sorrow, entirely unequipped for single parenthood. He visited her for the first 2 years, Ricardo told me, his voice heavy with the weight of a confidence held for decades. Then Clara's mother moved, remarried, and asked him, gently but firmly, to step back entirely, to allow Beatrice to grow up without the complication of grief that his presence inevitably represented. He agreed to that too. He believed, I think, that he had already caused this child enough loss simply by existing in her earliest months. I asked Ricardo whether my mother had known any of this. "Everything," he said. "Your mother knew everything. She met your father 3 years after Clara's death, when he was, by his own admission, barely functioning. She knew about Beatrice. She encouraged him, more than once, to reach out again as Beatrice grew older. He never did. I believe the guilt had calcified into something he simply could not disturb, without risking his own collapse." I left Ricardo's home that evening with an entirely new understanding of my father, one built not upon absence or deception exactly, but upon a grief so profound that he had constructed his entire subsequent life around avoiding it, a decision that had, without his intending it, denied me the knowledge that I possessed, somewhere in the world, an older half-sister. It took me nearly 3 more months to locate Beatrice. She was, as it turned out, 40 years old, living just 2 states away, working as a veterinarian, married with 2 teenage children of her own. When I finally wrote to her, uncertain how such a letter should even begin, I included copies of the photographs, uncertain whether she would receive them as a gift or an intrusion. Her response arrived 3 weeks later. She had known, she wrote, that her biological father was alive somewhere, though her grandmother had told her very little beyond his name and the fact that he had not been able to raise her. She had never attempted to find him, partly out of respect for the grandmother who raised her, and partly, she admitted, out of a fear of rejection that had calcified into simply not asking. We have spoken several times since, first hesitantly over the telephone, then eventually in person, over a lunch that lasted nearly 4 hours and left both of us emotionally depleted in a way that felt, nonetheless, strangely restorative. We are, undeniably, strangers who share half our biology and an entire absent father between us. We are still, slowly, carefully, determining what, if anything, we might become to one another. What I have come to understand in the months since I first opened that water-stained box in my father's attic is that grief, when insufficiently processed, does not simply disappear. It relocates. It buries itself in silence, in unopened letters, in fruit trees tended with obsessive devotion, in a lifetime of quiet reserve that I had once mistaken for simply my father's temperament, rather than recognizing it as the visible architecture of a wound he had never permitted to heal properly. My father's story teaches us something uncomfortable but important. First, the people closest to us are capable of carrying entire unspoken chapters of their lives, chapters shaped not necessarily by deceit, but by grief too large to articulate. Second, silence is rarely neutral. It is often simply pain that has not yet found its language. Third, discovering a difficult truth about someone we loved does not retroactively diminish the love itself. It merely deepens and complicates our understanding of the person who offered it. Fourth, it is never too late to extend a hand toward a connection that circumstance, grief, or fear once foreclosed. Now it's time to learn vocabulary from today's story. Inheritance means something passed down from one generation to another, whether property, money, or, as in this story, unspoken history. Example, her inheritance included far more than the house itself. Meticulous means extremely careful and precise about details. Example, he kept meticulous records of his expenses. Disintegrating means falling apart or breaking down gradually. Example, the letters were held by a disintegrating rubber band. Candor means honesty and openness in expression. Example, the letters were written with striking emotional candor. Trespassing means entering somewhere without permission, here used figuratively. Example, she felt as though she were trespassing on his past. Reconcile means to make two seemingly contradictory things fit together. Example, she tried to reconcile the father she knew with the man in the letters. Excised means removed or cut out completely. Example, this chapter of his life had been excised from the family narrative. Frailty means physical weakness, especially due to age or illness. Example, despite his frailty, his mind remained sharp. Calcified means having become hardened or fixed over time, often used figuratively for emotions. Example, the guilt had calcified into silence. Foreclosed means prevented or made impossible, often used about opportunities. Example, fear had foreclosed any attempt to reconnect. Try to use these words in your own sentences. That is one of the best ways to remember them, especially at this more advanced level. Now it's time for shadowing practice. Listen and repeat after me. Speak slowly, clearly, and with feeling. I found a box I was never meant to find. My father carried a grief he never spoke of. Silence is rarely neutral. It is pain without language. Discovering the truth did not diminish my love for him. It only deepened my understanding of who he was. Grief, left unspoken, does not disappear. It relocates. It is never too late to reach toward what was once impossible. Practice these lines several times. Try to capture the emotional weight of each sentence, not merely the correct pronunciation. Thank you so much for listening to this story on Easy English Stories. I hope this story helped you practice more advanced English while sitting with something genuinely emotional and human. Now, I have a few questions for you. Have you ever discovered something unexpected about someone close to you after they were gone? Do you think Antonio made the right decision all those years ago in stepping away from Beatrice's life? What would you do if you found a box like this one in your own family's attic? Please write your answers in the comments. I would love to read your thoughts. If this story moved you, please like the video, share it with a friend, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Take care, keep learning, and see you next time on Easy English Stories.